I've prepared this tip sheet for academic writing in APA style for students in my courses, and I'll share it here with you. Let me point out, though, as I mentioned here in the opening, that this is a secondary source of knowledge for you, the reader. I've compiled these tips based on my assessment of student papers over the years and what I find to be some common errors in applying APA style. But the references, the attributions, quote, citations that I use to APA style and to other sources come from my direct observations of those sources, and therefore for me they're primary sources. However, when you read these tips and look at the quotes and citations that I've added, for you they're secondary sources. So you need to be careful and use only the direct sources, primarily the APA style manual, as the basis for your application of APA style. But this is a useful reference sheet and a reference source, and I just want to use it as an example of some common errors that you should be aware of and try to avoid. I'm not going to cover every tip, but let me just point out a few for examples, and I'll attach a copy of this tip sheet to the video and let you read through the rest. But again, use this only as a reference and rely on the actual APA style manual for your guidelines. Item number 2, it's very common for students to refer to an author or an author's publication in the present tense. APA demands that we use past tense. Since the work has been published, you would say, for instance, the author Barrett in 2008 noted past tense. And here I'll give you, for each tip, the source of those guidelines. I note here that for quotations that consist of 40 or more words, you'd use a block quote format instead of the regular text citation. And you can find that described in the APA manual on page 171. Here I mentioned that you should punctuate quotes properly. Sometimes I find students place commas outside the quotation marks. In fact, they should go inside a quotation mark in almost all cases. Be careful of ellipses. Those are the 3 periods that indicate a deletion of content from a quote. You want to consider that ellipsis as a replacement for words. So the ellipsis really represents a word or words. You want to make sure, in most cases, you space once on either side of the ellipsis when it consists of a deletion of content from the middle of a sentence. And as you'll read in the APA manual, there are other rules for deleting content at the end of a sentence. In those cases, you would use 4 periods. Tip 8, be very careful about your capitalization. It's easy to overcapitalize. Take a look at the tip here about capitalizing only those titles that form a direct part of a person's title. Other tips would include using active voice. Passive voice is probably one of the most common errors that I see when assessing student papers, and I explain in tip 9 here the difference between active voice and passive voice. Tip 10, also a very common error, and that is the spacing after punctuation marks. You want to make sure you space once after a period, commas, colons, semicolons, with very rare exceptions. This would include spacing once after a page citation, for instance, P period space 10, and after each initial of an author's first name in a reference list citation. Here you can see in the sample APA paper from the APA manual on page 49 a reference list. The reference list includes a number of authors beginning with a last name, comma, and then their first initials. And note here that each of these references have a period after the initial of the first name, and in some cases the middle initial. Note also that you have a comma separating the author's names if there are more than one author. Tip number 16, be very careful about numbering. You generally want to spell out numbers that begin a sentence and numbers less than 10, unless you're using numbers that represent data from part of your research. So look that reference up in the APA manual. Avoid slashes, or what we call virgules, again, unless it's part of a mathematical expression. Be careful about uses of that and which. When using which, you want to precede which with a comma. When using that to connect two phrases, there is no punctuation mark. And finally, tip number 24, I want to stress, refrain from citing secondary sources. Rely only on primary sources when citing material in your scholarly papers. And by a primary source, I mean you would have direct observation of that source before you would quote or attribute it. For example, if you're reading a textbook on communication theory and the authors or editors quote a scholarly article from a journal, a book, etc., they are using that quote from a direct source that they have observed. If you would like to quote that in your paper, rather than use the secondary citation from the communication theory textbook, you'd want to go to the reference list at the end of that chapter or book, look up the original source, and then quote from that. It does take a little bit of time and effort to research and find original sources, but again, that's all part of your graduate program of study, the discipline to do proper scientific research rather than rely on someone's interpretation of a source. So again, this tip sheet is by no means comprehensive. It simply points out a couple of dozen common errors that I found in my assessment of papers over the years. If you pay attention to these tips, you'll save yourself quite a few mistakes, and I encourage you to move beyond the tip sheet and actually become familiar with the APA style manual itself.